Welcome back, everyone. We got a fun one for you today. So this is a dens case with bleaching. So as you can see on that three-dimensional scan, right where that dens is on the lingual there, going straight down into this tooth, which has very clearly died. And when we look at it clinically, you can see when it died, it left some mysterious staining behind. Now, when you look at these teeth, you want to make sure, usually dens cases like this are going to be bilateral. And in this case it was, but 7 was vital. So the very first thing we're going to do is actually go in and seal that up to make sure it doesn't happen to this tooth as well. I've already both etched and done the sandblasting on this tooth to make sure we get things looking nice and cleaned up. And we're going to go in here now with our bonding agent like normal. Coming in here with just a regular old sealant material. So I do keep sealant material around in the office. I don't really do it much on patients. I didn't even charge him because it's such a straightforward process. It's mostly to work on my children and the children of my employees when they go in and need sealants done. So keep some sealant material around it. You never know when you're going to use it, but in this case you want to get this sealed up so that we don't have issues with this with number 7 as well. So looks really good. You'll see me polish this off I think here at the end of the one of them, but pretty much just the bite, and that's how we do a sealant. So let's talk about how we remove the dens on these cases. So I'm going to start off using the EG3 burr, and the dens actually feels a little bit softer. You can feel it as you're brushing along there. You can see the brushing motion that I'm doing here, and you want to remove the dens prior to doing the actual root canal. So this axis is going to look a little bit funky compared to the other ones that you've seen me do, and that's on purpose because we want to get the dens out of there. So that EG3 burr is nice because it's almost like a fissurotomy burr in its own way, but I don't like keeping extra things around. So that's kind of what we're doing here, is almost a fissurotomy, and then we're going to go in with the regular 850 workhorse like we would normally to clean out the rest of it and do the actual access. So in this case, yes, the access, if it were just a normal tooth, I'd be more, towards the incisal edge, but a cingulum style access here is actually pretty decent, and you can see that extent where the dens was and then down into the area where the actual canal is. So going in and doing our normal process for any root canal. I'm going in with a VT Scout here to get that cleaned out. Kind of a little bit funkiness as well. You'll often find this on dens cases, that it's a little bit harder to get that initial kind of drop down into the area, and that's because the dens can actually bulge into the canal itself and kind of create a restriction. So go ahead and do our working length like we do normally. I skip through all this because you guys know exactly how that works. Long tooth on this one. Ended up needing to bring up my edge files. I switched from edge to Brasseler about a year ago, but I still had a ton of the 25mm stock remaining. So I'm still using edges stuff for the 25mm for the time being, and that's what we're using here. The 1704, these are their just kind of knock out, they're pretty much straightforward. The X7's their universal one, so it's an easy file to use. A little more aggressive than the Brasslers. That's one of the reasons that I switched. I also was having trouble with file separation for like no reason whatsoever, not putting any pressure on them, and that's the other reason we did it. So you can see the bubbles coming up there, a lot of activity, and we're gonna get some good drainage here coming through the actual microsuction. Want to get this thing as dry as possible. I'm gonna be using calcium hydroxide on this just because of the size of the infection, and we're gonna be seeing him back anyway to do the bleach changes on this tooth. So get it nice and dry. Go ahead and use those paper points like we would normally, and then we'll use calcium hydroxide to get this all cleaned out. With dens cases here, it's good to medicate them. Usually the infections have been going on for a long time. They're pretty gnarly teeth. You don't really necessarily want to have to do a surgery if you don't have to, so I like to medicate these. Now, I'm going to be doing the internal bleaching process. We'll talk about that in a second, and you do need to put a barrier. You can sometimes get away with calcium hydroxide of just putting on top of there, but I knew I was going to need multiple changes of this, so roll that cavet up on top of there, and that's all I'm using here is just cavet, and now it's ready for the sodium perborate for the walking bleach technique. So we are going to have a bit of a chemistry aside here. This is the chemical compound for sodium perborate, and so what's going to happen is when you mix it with water, it's going to undergo hydrolysis. That sodium ion is going to pop off, and then the sodium perborate is going to split into perborate and the hydrogen peroxide ion. And the hydrogen peroxide is what actually does the bleaching for us. How that process works is when we have staining inside a tooth, long chain chemical compounds start to form, and they actually absorb more light. That's why these teeth usually get dark, is because of these long chain compounds inside there. What happens is the hydrogen peroxide then breaks off and creates the free radical where we have one electron missing. This is incredibly reactive, and we'll actually go through and chop up those long chain compounds. You then bring them back, rinse it out, and that's actually how the bleaching process works with the walking bleach technique. So chemistry diversion aside. All right, this is the actual material itself. I use a combination of 2 different sodium perborate preparations. You can see the larger ball-shaped ones. That's what I just get from Henry Schein. That's the one that dentists and endodontists have used for years and years and years. But you'll notice there's almost a powder paste in there too. I have a laboratory grade one that's really finely ground that I mix with the actual kind of larger process. And what that does is twofold. It almost kind of forms a really solid paste pretty much it's easier to pack in there and easier to kind of fill in all the voids. The finely ground stuff also works a little bit faster, which is nice, and then the larger balls kind of cover it for the rest of the time. So I found that by mixing these two together, and I'll drop links below for this, it works out really nicely for bleaching because not only does it work faster, it also is a little bit easier to place, a little harder to remove, but really it's not that hard to remove in general. So put a little bit of water in there because it was looking a little bit dry there, and then we're going to go ahead and temporize this. Now, I am definitely at fault of not putting enough cavit in sometimes, and you'll see these come out. And what you want to do is almost this brushing technique where you fill about halfway, brush up, fill about halfway, brush down, because I'm only going to have like 1 millimeter or 2 of cavit inside here. I want to pack this as full of bleach as possible, of the sodium perborate, and then you dry it off like normal. So you'll see here in a second what that x-ray looks like, that there really is not a lot of cavit sealing up that tooth. You want to drop the material below the CEJ as well. I usually try to go about 1 millimeter below. Took a couple changes, but that's what it looked like. Just to remind you, here's where we were to begin with. So when you see the side by side, I think this was 3 total changes of the perborate. That tooth looks way, way better than where we started off. And the red tends to take a couple changes, but I can get pretty good luck on bleaching those. Browns aren't too bad, yellows aren't too bad. Black is the hardest by far, because usually it's amalgam stains, and those are very difficult to get out. Now, one trick I like to do is you have to remove that cavit down inside there. You can actually just poke it with an Endo Explorer like I'm doing here, kind of dislodge it a little bit, and then if you come back in with a 2006, you'll have created like a little guide path using that, and it pops out the cavit really nicely. So what we're going to do here is finish up the case. I'm going to speed through this because you've seen this about 1,000 times if you've watched the channel before. And bleach, activate, EDTA, activate, rinse with the isopropyl alcohol, and get ready to fill. I am going to use the squirt technique on this one. It's a long case, and so I'm not really worried about how much apical pressure I'm going to be able to put on there. I'm not really worried, and it was asymptomatic at this point. So go ahead and go with those paper points. You can see I definitely hit the part of the dens when I first went in there, which is why it bent. But everything's nice and dry. That's what it looks like. You can see where that area where the dens was located. You do want to make sure you take that out whenever you're working on these cases as well, which leads to kind of funky looking accesses for sure. Go back in, and we're going to use the squirt fill. I sped up a lot of this as well because you guys have seen this 100 times. So fill it back up. Looks great. Here is what that final picture looks like as far as the gutta percha in here. This dentist likes to restore the teeth herself, so he will be sending back to her and looking like that as far as our sponge and cavit. And just to remind you, this is what's so cool about this technique is you can pretty much change someone's life in a little bit of time. You know, no one really wants to have a red tooth like that, and to be able to bleach it very conservatively, the patient's not going to need a crown on top of here. It is a fantastic procedure you can offer your patients. So as always, thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions about this, I know bleaching is a little bit weird. I know I went into some chemistry that we don't normally go into on this channel, but I really appreciate you all watching. Once again, like and subscribe, and I will talk to you all next time. Thanks.